our moderator, Anat Patel.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's an interesting topic. I think personally, we're all down with the pandemic, but unfortunately, the pandemic is not done with us. So we've got a great esteemed panelist in front of me that's going to discuss the impact on businesses. I'm going to do a short introduction to our three amazing panelists that we have this afternoon, depending on where you are. First and foremost, Ross Duvall, President and CEO of Heartland Forward. Ross's current role is to promote regional innovation, entrepreneurship, and stimulate economic growth in the heartland of America. And I'm sure you've heard of Ross before because he's been a renowned speaker when it comes to micro and macro economics and former chief research officer at the Milken Institute. So welcome, Ross.
Thank you, Anat, for that kind introduction.
There you are. There's much more I can say with all the panelists, so I'm going to shortchange you, unfortunately, with a brief introduction. Next up is Angie Tim, CFO of Fed Up Foods. Fed Up Foods is an amazing, fast-growing, better-for-you beverage company headquartered in North Carolina. Angie has had several roles with significant brands, private label consumer product companies. And again, welcome, Angie, and we'll appreciate your participation today.
Thank you, Anat.
And finally, Thomas Beer, CEO of SSF Imported Auto Parts, one of the largest US importers and wholesale distributor of replacement European auto parts, headquartered here in San Francisco, California, with locations nationally, I think over 10 locations nationally. Thomas has had a lot of experience both in the logistics and the transportation industries for many, many years. Again, Thomas, appreciate you being here and looking forward to hearing some words of wisdom from you.
Well, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So as the topic is near and dear to all of us, and I know there are a lot of business owners here as well, one of the biggest themed elements that has impacted us personally, as well as from a business perspective, is talent and labor. Probably one of the most significant disruptions, arguably, in the last year and a half to 2 years. Ross, I'm going to kick things off with you, and I've heard you say something to the extent that there are 10 million job openings here in the US that cannot find a home, cannot be fulfilled. Can you maybe set the scene as we discuss this topic in a macro level of what's going on through the pandemic phase, and why is that the case? And I'd love to interject with Angie and Thomas to provide their perspective in terms of how it affects their companies as well. You're on mute, Ross.
I apologize for that.
No worries.
I have two mouses. I clicked the wrong one. No, it's a great question. We're all pondering why there are 10.5 million job openings currently in the United States. I think there are a number of factors that are still causing that situation. One is the Delta variant itself. The infection rate has been so high and the cases have gone up. There have been a number of people who have not been able to report to work because they have the Delta variant. But then there's some other contributing factors, such as much of the labor force has not come back due to childcare circumstances. This has affected a number of women, affects men as well. But because of the challenges in getting children back into school, and some are still operating classes from home, we've seen fewer people re-enter the labor market. And until recently, I would say the kind of enhanced unemployment benefit insurance probably caused some people not to come back into the labor force, although we can question just how severe that's been. But also there are a number of people who are quite frankly just scared of the Delta variant and returning back to a place of work where there could be some very tight operating conditions, whether it's in manufacturing, but especially in the service industry. leisure and hospitality, we started to see a rebound this summer, June, July, and into early August. But with the Delta variant spreading, people haven't been as open to going back out, and some workers have just chosen to stay away.
If I may add on to this, on the ground level, I mean, we see a lot of serious, major challenges in hiring labor for our warehouses. It's extremely competitive, specifically with, Amazon hiring another 175,000 people temporarily, and others. That puts someone, I think, without such a big brand name in a tougher position. And our focus is basically we have to beat our next door neighbor for the team members in our warehouses, not whatever FedEx or UPS. But the flip side, I have to say, the big benefit is, I mean, the idea that we have a product manager working out of Canada, hired in Canada, would have been completely unimaginable 2 years ago. So I think when it comes to very skilled positions, the market is still extremely tight. However, I think you're not limited to your local, regional, or even national borders anymore if you're looking for the right person for the job. It's kind of the benefit if we get past the current tightness.
I would say, Angie, you are one of the individuals, right? Maybe explain the company, explain where you are and how you plug into your organization, as well as the impact of labor and the tremendous growth that your company has had, right, in terms of just the explosion of growth and just hiring talent.
Sure. So I am physically located in Phoenix. The company I work for is in North Carolina, as Anant had said. I actually had been their CFO prior to the pandemic and was commuting back and forth. And obviously during the pandemic, it became more of an issue. We did allow a lot of our administrative staff to go offsite during the pandemic, and that is something that's continuing today. They have a mixed schedule where they'll be on site 1 day a week or 2 days a week, and then they work from their home offices the others. Our primary workforce, though, is manufacturing, and we've always had a challenge to fill those positions. Obviously, the pandemic made it more difficult, and we, as a leadership team, made a decision to put forth a $2 an hour increase for all of our employees, and then also reevaluated all of our salaried employees as well to make sure that their pay rates were within the higher spectrum. That being said, we continue to face challenges. Immediately following this webinar, I have a meeting with an employee who has been offered more pay to take a job, and we need to see if we can compete to keep her. So I don't think it's short-lived. I think it's going to keep going, and companies are going to have to get creative on how they deal with it.
So let me explore that and ask the panelists. Thomas, you kind of opened up the disruption and the shortage of warehouse laborers, but also the opportunities in attracting talent that doesn't live or work within kind of your headquarters. So there's an opportunity there. We, as an accounting firm, have certainly seen that as well. How have you had to pivot your way of thinking, the way that you work, and marry that with the great mobility of the labor force that we've seen? But I think the pandemic has probably exploded that, right? In the opportunities where people kind of wake up and say, I want to move to whatever, and I don't want to do this, and so forth. How are you acquiring those talents, and how are you retaining that in a labor force that Angie mentioned that's fierce, and everyone's trying to go after the same pool of talent? Maybe Thomas, I'll throw that to you.
Interesting question. I'd say this is very different for our teams in our warehouses that have to be on site, and then our administrative, product management, purchasing, marketing, whatever staff. The second, we're not really concerned. We're actually kind of excited about knowing going forward that we can hire the talent pretty much wherever they are. And they can also work for us from wherever they are, because in the past, with the headquarters in South San Francisco, we're surrounded by biotech and Silicon Valley pretty much. And as a wholesale distributor in the automotive parts business, you know, you're talking very different pay levels. So that has been a challenge in the past. People did not want to move to either San Francisco or LA easily, or couldn't financially. That problem is, I would say, pretty much off the table, which is great. On the warehouse side, however, we're just, you know, looking into or creating our plan for the next 5 years, where we want to build our next locations. And definitely one of the factors that we never considered as a variable in the decision-making process is, where do we feel hiring is the least challenging? Because I think the worst is if you start fresh somewhere, you're a new player in the market, and your entire team is new. That makes it even harder. I mean, we have in our main locations, we have a core team that's with us for whatever, 5, 10 and more years. We're pretty confident they're not that much at risk to be, you know, hired for $2 more somewhere on the other side of the neighborhood. But when you don't have that foundation starting somewhere, I think this will be a different dimension for all companies to consider, where, you know, do you have the best chances to mobilize new teams and get on board. It's a tricky one. We don't have a great answer to that yet. Specifically, it's hard to see, and Ross may know that hopefully better, but it's not easy for us to see where specifically that labor pool will come back in the numbers that seems to be needed. So I think we will have to come up with very clever strategies to manage the shortage.
Do you want to comment on that, Ross, as the question was posed to you?
Yeah, there probably was one element that I didn't discuss. We've had a number of what I'm going to call early retirements because of COVID-19. Those individuals that were close enough that they could retire, maybe not full retirement salary, but still they chose to go ahead and do so. It's going to be a challenge to get many of these workers to come back into the labor force. I mean, back to Angie's comment about wages being bid up, if you look at lower wage jobs, we've seen the most wage pressure there with increases. You know, we're up to seeing gains 5, 6, 7, 8% now, nearly across the board. And this is unusual. Early on, it was largely professionals that were in high demand. But that's going to be an ongoing pressure, and figuring out how different ways to mitigate those wage pressures and still, you know, have a positive rate of return, especially given all the supply chain challenges that we face around the world today.
You know, one thing. Sorry, go ahead.
I would just also point out that as intriguing as it is to have employees in different locations, it does create extra reporting responsibilities and taxation situations that every organization is going to have to face as, you know, as they expand their workforce.
So Angie, and maybe Thomas, if you could lead into that. We as a firm also were kind of located in LA. Most of our people lived in LA, and now, as we've all experienced a hybrid workforce, they're in different time zones and so forth. Are there cultural elements of, you mentioned, you know, how you monitor, review, and have mechanisms in terms of how people plug in and so forth? Are there cultural impacts or how to maintain the culture within the organization things that you didn't think about previously that you're thinking about now. Maybe Thomas, you've expanded significantly, just knowing you for so many years in terms of the different presences you have. So you had a blueprint pre-pandemic, but when you have a dispersed workforce, different locations and so forth, is that a significant challenge? And how are you kind of getting or overcoming that challenge and making sure that the culture is still a similar culture, whether it's in the East Coast or the West Coast?
Well, in a sense, I'd say we have, you may want to call it the advantage that we had that challenge before already with a headquarter in San Francisco, but teams in Southern California, in Georgia. Our sales team was already, before the pandemic, pretty much working almost entirely from home. So we have, we had our events and communication with the entire team built around this before the pandemic. So the pandemic was pretty much a continuation, maybe an advanced version of it, but the cultural aspect has not been a big change for us, a challenge. What's challenging is obviously, we always organize to see our team quarterly, every manager. That part is missing, and but I think on a management level, we spend more time together than we ever have, because everybody is available all the time through on screen. So far, not such a big deal, but am I concerned if this will have a long-term effect or challenge when it comes to the next generation of specifically skilled work that is not part of our warehouse teams? I mean, they have their own culture everywhere, very tight, good groups. But when you get IT, marketing, purchasing team members involved, that they've never seen their colleagues over 3, 4, 5 years. I think we will learn if that is a challenge or not.
Anyone else want to comment there before I flip to another theme discussion? Just one topic generally on the inflation and the challenge of hiring. Yeah. I think one big issue I don't know if that's really considered in the public discussions. I think I hear this from colleagues and competitors and customers. Everybody has the same issue, that we need to raise price or pay levels to attract new employees, which unfortunately, or fortunately for our team members, means we have to raise everybody to that level. And the first round we did, we pretty much, at the end of the day, after 2 months, almost everybody was gone of the few that joined. So we experienced a inflation without any benefit. And I think that's easily overlooked these days. Everybody I hear deals with that problem. I want to kind of pause on that and probably talk about that amongst other business risks and so forth as we look to the future. But let's pause on that, Thomas. I'll come back to it. The next topic of discussion, and again, all of these are big topics, and we can spend hours on this, but supply chain, again, you think about something that's been so disruptive. I have to tell you a personal story. I just came back from the UK and spent a good part of my time traveling from the south of the country to the north of the country. I experienced it myself, went through 4 gas stations, and the 5th gas station actually had petrol in there. So it's got nothing to do with a supply of gasoline, but it's a supply of drivers. So it's been mind-boggling as I've viewed this. I've spoken to clients where things that you didn't think about are being impacted. And Thomas and Angie, maybe I'll start with you, Angie, in terms of supply chain. And obviously it depends on where you're sourcing your goods and products, whether domestic, international. And the goods and products themselves have so many different nuances that one chain that's broken could have an impact. Angie, can you talk about that? And obviously, I think you've done some really creative things in looking at your supply chain and maybe pivoting and so forth, and talk to some of the disruption, but also talk to some of the opportunities that you've used to kind of take an advantage of that.
Sure. So we actually started pre-pandemic thinking about our bottle source. We bottle beverages in glass. 2019, there was a tariff on glass coming out of China. So we knew that we wanted to end our relationship with China. We eventually found a supplier out of Thailand, but then also wanted to consider our footprint and basically started looking domestically. And in 2020, started buying glass right in North Carolina. So it worked out well. There was definitely a transition as they started to manufacture our glass, and it didn't work as well. But I will say that, you know, talking to other beverage suppliers that are still getting their glass from overseas, most of them are paying more now for shipping than they are for the bottles themselves. That's a huge adjustment. For us, we're not facing that. But there are things that we do source internationally, including sugar, tea, for some of our products. And so we're now realizing that there are going to be increased expenses. We've made it through this year, but going into next year, they're projecting some very large increases that we're having to put into our model. So I will say that we did get lucky on some of them, and we're able to secure increased supply and basically found warehousing for them as well. Not everyone was that lucky. So I think going forward, companies are going to look to secure more inventory. Just in time is probably not going to be something that people look for the next 6 months. They're going to want to have more on hand and feel that there's some security in what they have.
Which has impact in terms of how you think about your business, how you operate your business, the working capital that's required to sustain that level of inventory. Have you also, Angie, looked at, you may have had your vendors that you went for in terms of your input prices and so forth. Are you expanding that? Is it coming from different locations? And some of your materials may be geographically centered, right? Are you kind of adding more vendor sources to, again, ensure the supply as well as maybe potentially the pricing of those goods?
Yeah, we have kept our sourcing person, we call her our sorceress, very busy. And she is looking for alternatives. And for a lot of our products, we don't have alternatives. And so she is looking to see if there are possibilities. Not always possible with private label when you have committed to a certain recipe and certain ingredients. So we continue to look, but so far we haven't had to change vendors or have found those that we can use in lieu of the ones we currently are using.
Thomas, as the importer of the auto parts, maybe speak to what you're experiencing. Again, same question to you in terms of how you're dealing with the disruption, getting ahead of the disruption, and maybe some creative ways of doing things that are different to what you did before.
Absolutely. We import about 60% of the product that we sell, and the vast majority of that's coming out of Europe. Our suppliers are, mainly the OE parts manufacturers, meaning they produce for the car manufacturers the part that we then, the identical part, receive in the parts manufacturers' box. They are very complex manufacturing and supply chains that they run with global manufacturing and major distribution centers all over Europe. It's a really interesting experience to see how they're handling it. Overall, product availability is definitely suffering, but I would say, let's say the fill rates that are 10% lower than usual. Considering the circumstances, I'm actually not too unhappy about it. I feared worse, so we can live with that. We've seen a couple of them trying to bring their product or inventory their product in the US, some distribution partnerships and joint ventures. The amazing, or not so amazing actually, experience for us was that it really threatened and challenged the availability of that product quite a bit. And we went back from sourcing from their local warehouses back to importing it out of Europe, simply because I think it's a little naive to believe if a foreign manufacturer brings this product here and then you buy it from here, it's exactly the same challenge. They have the same problems with freight capacity and warehousing shortages and labor shortages. So we figured we're actually better off going back to the source in Europe where things are working, quite well and almost as we expected. And then, we obviously deal with the problems of sea freight and harbor delays and stuff like that. But I think it's really naive to believe, well, then we all make it here and those problems go away, because an economy that, I don't know how much overall we have imported in recent decades, but we cannot bring 30% of production and product into the country and believe that would function. There's just too much technology and just volume and skill that is so well distributed around the globe. Unfortunately or fortunately, you cannot dislocate that easily.
Ross, I'm going to turn it to you because I know working in the heartland, and I've heard you speak about this in supply chain, and you'll probably comment that this is not an interim process. This is going to take a long time to shake out. And what are you seeing in terms of different elements of supply chain? I have heard stories, and I somewhat agree with you, Thomas. Meaningful manufacturing coming back to the US may not be the case, but I am seeing our companies looking at alternatives, including the US as a base of certain elements of manufacturing. Ross, can you maybe talk to that and what's going on, not just in the heartland area, but as you have a viewpoint on the macro, as well as what you see internationally?
Well, we've certainly heard many of the supply chain challenges, and they're real. Some of it is temporary as we re-engage the global manufacturing industry, and there's a high demand for building inventory, given what just happened, as Angie was saying. But I would agree that in the near term, there's limited opportunities for reshoring. But I think what the pandemic has done is it has really highlighted many of the challenges that were posed by offshoring production of American manufacturers over recent decades. And we can certainly understand the financial incentives for locating operations overseas, but I think a lot of these, I'll call them perceived cost advantages, were not really accurate. Various studies show that sometimes firms fail to estimate the actual cost of production overseas by as much as 20%. And there are probably between 10 to 30% of projects that were currently being considered for locating production outside the US prior to COVID-19 that would actually be cheaper to manufacture in the United States. And let's be frank, a lot of this gets back to China at the center of the global supply chain, and we look at reshoring. This isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but we really do believe, as we look to the future, every challenge presents an opportunity. And because many firms, I think, underestimated the cost of moving overseas, and think about the risks, such as ocean freight rates escalating to the extent that they have, as Angie stated, regarding the cost of transportation being more than the value of the product itself. But I think we're going to see a number of opportunities, we would say, especially for the center of the country, what we call the heartland, but even in lower cost locations around the country. Production costs are going to matter, but these factors aren't as important today as they might have been in the past. Automation, we're seeing tremendous productivity improvements. We're seeing rapidly changing consumer preferences. And let's face it, wages in China had begun rising. Malaysia, still fairly low low wage rates there, but also looking at the quality of products and can they be improved in the US? So this is an ongoing challenge. I do believe that it's a chance of reshoring. It's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to bring low value added manufacturing back to the United States, but longer term, it is a legitimate opportunity as long as it has leadership from both the federal and state level and the proper incentives and not just sticks. The Trump administration tried to use sticks, they were tariffs. You can get people's attention with sticks, but carrots are more likely. So kind of a manufacturing reinvestment tax credit could be an idea to bring some of that back home.
Questions, Ross? Sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
Just a thought on that. It's very interesting, Ross, and I think personally, I think what we learned with, let's say, more instability on really the key global relations and realizing they can go sideways or even worse than that. I think strategic products, I think as a country, we would be very well advised to consider what should and needs to be done at home. But if I look, let's say, a company like ours, the European cars is about 7% of the car park in the US. No car manufacturer is going to move its parts production because of that here. I mean, many don't even make most cars are not, European branded cars are not made in the US anyways. And in there, I honestly think fixing the transportation, the sea freight, that's, I would think, a relatively simple problem to solve in comparison, to move entire industries, because containers are easy to build. Container ships, I heard lately, the Koreans built these mega freight ships in 90 days. I think the only thing we need is a few more harbors. It's not that easy, but comparatively, isn't that something we should be able to solve relatively easily? Because currently everybody said, freight is the problem. But as soon as you bring product here and the over demand is gone, then freight will adjust naturally. It's not too complex of a product or service.
Thomas, I don't disagree. It's not going to work for every industry, but I can tell you there's a lot of interest of foreign producers coming to the US. I've worked in various heartland states, and it is a real trend. Your industry, I don't want to say is unique, but it has certain characteristics. We're not going to see a mass movement of global production to the US. That's simply not going to happen. But I think you have to think strategically about your supply chain and which components of it make the most sense. I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say you're going to see more semiconductor manufacturing capacity being added in the United States. Right. You're seeing discussions around this country of locating those facilities in places where they've never occurred before, right? A lot of it's going to go to Texas, some's going to go to Arizona. You're even seeing discussions in places like Ohio and Indiana. So there is no one solution to this challenge. You're right that we can increase capacity of global freight. That's currently underway, but it's going to require a reconfiguration of the entire logistics and supply chain, in my opinion.
So what I'm
hearing... and then circling back to the other topic, it means that we're going to have more competition for the labor pool.
Right. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that this supply chain issue is not going to iron itself out anytime soon. It's drawn out, number one. Number two, there's not going to be a seismic shift to bring back everything in the US. We don't have the infrastructure or the ability to do that. But Ross, what I'm hearing from you is that there's an opportunity for those that are listening here to really strategically look at certain elements of supply chain to expand, enhance, or have an alternative mechanism that maybe is a different way of thinking about things that not only reevaluates the cost of the supply, but part of cost of supply is just getting timely product as well, which is the monetary impact of that, as well as quality and so forth. So I'm hearing there's an opportunity to kind of reshift certain industries, certain products, certain businesses to think about things differently, that the pandemic has allowed us to experience it, that maybe pre-pandemic we were not fortunate to see that in visibility. Now, let me ask you.
Yeah, let me just say one last thing on China. We know that's the elephant in the room, and we now have to also consider geopolitical risk associated with China as it relates to supply chains. And I think that's a new element that has not really been factored in historically. But if you don't consider that today, you are at great peril.
The other thing I think is worth mentioning about the supply chain, I think one of the really unfortunate consequences of the challenges here right now is the benefit or the less of a challenge larger organizations have versus small and medium-sized entrepreneurs. I mean, if you receive whatever 2 containers a year of a specialty product and your container is 3 months late, that could easily end your business. I mean, this is so tough for smaller companies, specifically also, just the financing. If you have to finance your inventory, whatever, 30, 60 days longer, that for many is just the end of it. And I think we will unfortunately see a shift here where, business moves from the dynamic, small, creative entrepreneurs to the large big players.
I mean, having scale and resource is going to matter, and it's going to kind of elbow out some of the ones that don't maybe have that access to capital, resources, and so forth. That's a great point, Thomas. Let me shift gears slightly and more macro elements of business risks. And with any risk, I would say, listening to the three of you, there's opportunities as well, right? So think about risks and opportunities. And whether it's the tight labor market, Andrew, you mentioned obviously labor rates are increasing. That has cost to your process, your operations. Inflation has to come in mind with that element. You think about supply chain, not just the fact that it's taking longer to bring product in, it's costing more because of transportation and so forth. Capacity of warehousing, potentially trade policies that you may be seeing, or Ross, you may be seeing kind of in the future, commodity prices. Angie, if I look at your business, fiscal policy, if I add that to kind of the mix of liquidity, and we've been fortunate, I guess, as businesses with a lot of liquidity pumped into the system for the last 2 years. If I mix all that together, and maybe I'll start with you, Ross, this time, what does that mean? And what are the 2 or 3 business risks that you see over the horizon, you see at the moment, and some opportunities there?
It's a great question. I think one of the biggest risks, as you pointed out, is that the Fed has injected massive amounts of liquidity into the system. It has worked fairly well. It's mitigated the severity of the recession and certainly allowed a more rapid recovery. It's allowed some small businesses to survive and medium-sized businesses that otherwise wouldn't have. So it's been a great thing. But as we move to the economy really reopening, hopefully after the Delta variant subsides a little bit, the Fed's got to look at withdrawing liquidity out of the system. We've heard of the taper tantrum that happened, almost a decade ago, not quite that now, but we're looking at a situation where the Fed is going to have to start withdrawing extraordinary monetary measures and start diminishing its purchases of long-term bonds, treasury, and mortgages as well. And the Fed has a delicate balancing act because on the one hand, COVID-19, Delta variant, who knows which other variants are going to run rampant in the future, pose downside risks. If we have higher inflation, which we currently are having in the US, and it sustains itself a bit longer than most experts believe, it's a really difficult call in terms of how much do you begin tapering those purchases, removing liquidity from the system. How do bond markets react? Do yields go up? And also think about the risks of on the equity markets. I mean, you've heard me say this before, but equity markets in the US especially are priced for perfection. And if anything doesn't go perfect in terms of liquidity, I think that's a real risk to the outlook that we all have to be considering. There's both upside and downside, but mainly I would say downside.
Same question to you, Andrew, in terms of how you think about all the external factors that are impacting your business. What are the risks for a growth food company, beverage company? How are you trying to mitigate some of those risks, and what are some opportunities maybe that you see in figuring things out?
So I think one of the biggest opportunities is that we've heard a lot about food insecurity. And, you know, during the pandemic, when the pandemic started, at least here in Phoenix, every day on the news, you saw people in line to get food because they couldn't get food, and food banks were just overwhelmed. And I think that addressing food insecurity is going to continue to be on the top of everyone's minds. To that end, I think private label manufacturers specifically are going to continue to be in demand because branded products have such a great marketing cost tied with them, where the private label products don't. That being said, you know, where a specialty fermented beverage comes in and all of that, you know, who knows? But I would say that I think that there, you know, specifically for private label, there are continued opportunities. All of the other risks, though, it's hard to imagine where and when it will end. I think that we're at the tip of the iceberg, and I think we're going to continue to see challenges in the labor area, in supply chain, in warehousing. Thomas had talked previously about, you know, where to build your next location. Where do you find your next warehouse? You know, there's a shortage of real estate in places as well. We lost one of our dry storage facilities, and basically, you know, drew a 45-minute circumference circle trying to figure out where we were going to find property so that we could relocate that operation. I think we're on a good path, but you know, it's a challenge, and I think it will continue to be a challenge.
Your perspective, Thomas.
Well, we are in a little bit of a unique situation in the sense that the demand for our products is clearly predefined by how many European vehicles are on the road, more than even how many are bought, because the relation between what we call vehicles in operation, that's the car park, versus new registration, is about 95 to 5, meaning 280 million vehicles in total in the US and 60 million, 70 million new vehicles a year. So we can pretty much clearly forecast the demand for parts, no matter how good or bad the economy is, for, you know, at least 5, even more 10 years from now. Cars don't care if the economy is good or bad. They break when they want to break, and they need to be fixed. So for us, it's more a what piece of the cake can we get from our competition, or maintain in our hands. I think about this question. Yeah, it may sound a little silly, but almost in a more philosophical way. That even before the pandemic, in conversations, I sometimes wondered, were we just lucky that this highly, highly complex universe of global economy did not misallocate and kind of get into a tailspin because things don't fit together anymore. And now it really got a big shaker, and it did get out of sync. Is there a natural kind of almost law of physics or biology, whatever you want to call it, that it comes back into balance? Or is there a risk that another kick could really throw things out of sorts in a way? I mean, for us, simple things, the biggest stress factor that we had in years is that because of the delays in the ports, a higher demand receiving of product, just incoming containers, all of a sudden we couldn't get them into our warehouse anymore. And what was there, we couldn't get on the shelves quick enough. And the next container is waiting, and the next one as well. And you're starting to really lose sleep over what happens if you have an outbreak. 10, 15 people are out of work for a week, and then you have a backlog that you are really absolutely not prepared for. How do you ever untie that? Knock on wood, it hasn't happened, but these are things that honestly we never worried about in the past, and they are threatening us. So in that context, I think the biggest risk is that these, just factors that we talked about, labor, transportation, supply chain, space, don't get into sync easily. That could be a bigger challenge than, figuring out what do we sell to whom, which we always thought is the number one issue of them all.
Ross, you're nodding your head there. Who better for me to ask? Will it fix itself? I'm presuming it's not going to be an easy journey and a complex journey, but part of me thinks, as a novice here, but I'll ask you, the expert, is that I always think disruption is a great opportunity, and it allows everyone, businesses, structures, and so forth, to really kind of open up the hood, pardon the pun, Thomas, and look at the engine and see, and maybe an opportunity to kind of refine the engine of how things put together. But Ross, is there any perspective that you can provide to us in terms of Thomas's query to himself of how do we put this back together again?
Well, his query to himself is a real one that everyone's thinking about, and I would agree it's probably the biggest risk that we face. There are a number, let's just say there's a greater interest in supply chain management and logistics among American universities and consulting firms that we've ever had in the past. And people are working with artificial intelligence. They're looking at algorithms to try and improve the fine tuning. It's going to take a while for that to kick in. The laws of physics are restraining us. If you have boats in the port that are not unloaded, you can't put more boats into the port to unload. But I do believe that probably by mid next year, maybe into the second half of the year, the greater challenges of the supply chain will diminish somewhat. It won't be fixed by then. But I do see us beginning to get back to where that's not an everyday concern, or I should say maybe an every hour concern.
It's only 7 or 8 months to go, guys and gals, right? I'm going to pivot to my last topic. We have 9 minutes, and there's a question that been posted. Technology. And I wonder, I think I know the answer. We were not all here in the last pandemic that happened over 100 years ago. Obviously, we're in the current pandemic. I wonder what this world would have looked like probably 15 years ago, right? Without the state of technology that we have in terms of how we operate individually, personally, how our people operate, and we operate our businesses and so forth. And that's just a reflection point. And I think that coupled with the injection of liquidity, what I've seen with our clients, certain sectors have done really, really badly and gone through some turmoil. Many clients have recovered quicker than what I thought. March, April of last year, and have actually done really, really well. My question to the group is technology in terms of how you utilize it yourself, how you actually embracing it, maybe how it's actually helping you to advance your business, your direction, your strategic end game, and so forth. I know, Thomas, you have, you are distributing auto parts, but I know from knowing you, there's a significant amount of technology that you've already embraced. Is there anything in addition to what I'm saying that's actually allowing you to think about it differently to enhance and execute your company's growth?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say the opportunities that were created by having to make advances quick were actually probably in hindsight, whatever, when the emotional burden and carnage of COVID is over, I think we'll realize what became possible. I mean, currently, whatever you see, the big digital companies being put on whatever on the wall a little bit because of Facebook and whatever. But I think the reality is, it has been a phenomenal equalizer in a sense between big and small, because a company like ours, we don't have the IT budgets, but you know what? Everything runs on Teams. We threw out our phone system that's over Teams. The amount of savings and reduction in complexity is phenomenal. And we're moving now out of our old technology, NetSuite, and connected products. It's almost like you go to the shelf in the supermarket and buy the same technology that your big competitors have, which is phenomenal. And I would agree with you in a way. I think 8 billion people won the lottery last year, because if this would have happened any time earlier in whatever our millions of years of existence, we would not have been able to get through this relatively unharmed economically. It would have been a total disaster. We would have had to shut doors 5 years ago or 3 years ago, because running our company remotely would have been completely impossible. I think this is really the interesting time, and maybe the big IT progress. It's kind of a little bit overshadowed by all the other events, but what small companies and even startups can do these days without technological expertise is phenomenal and really exciting. So on that point, we feel really encouraged. Things that we can think now that we can do, because IT, we know in a year, will not be our anchor anymore.
I've got a question I'm going to pose. Maybe I'll pose it to Angie, but I'm sure, Andrew, you're experiencing similar opportunities with technology, certainly for manufacturing companies with automation and so forth. And maybe we'll come back to that. We've got a few minutes. So this is a question for our panelists. Is there a consensus on when the labor supply may return to quote unquote normal? And we may have to kind of define what normal means. And what might be the factors in this happening versus not happening? Who wants to take that?
Well, I think the biggest factor is going to be when the labor rates get so high that companies have to close their doors. And when they have to close their doors, it means that there's going to be more people out there looking for jobs. And and they're going to have to settle for something different. And I don't necessarily know when that's going to happen, but I do think that while the opportunities for small and medium businesses that the government has provided have been helpful, I think that there is going to become a period where they've basically sustained themselves for a while and they can't grow and they maybe can't function any longer, especially with all of the pressure.
I think, yeah, this is a complex question. I think you will have two developments working a little bit against each other. One, I mean, you can start make really good money working in pretty basic jobs like in our warehouses currently. I mean, they're making so much money on overtime. I don't know how they will ever go back to normal, but let's say if you keep this as a basis, you know what, I think it will start moving a certain amount of college students away from more education, everybody who's on the fringe with high college costs versus an easy and predictable and safe way of making a steady, decent income. So that could balance things a little on that point of the horizon. However, I mean, I think what we're seeing currently is almost like a precursor to what some European and Asian countries see in terms of the challenging age pyramid, where, you know, birth rate's too low and the population gets too old. And I once read in an economics book, there is no sustained long-term growth has ever happened in populations that are not growing. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, immigration is the most sensitive political topic in that sense. But if we're not creating enough labor, we need to import it. I don't see an alternative to that.
And
Also, I'll give you the final words there.
Yeah, I'll keep it as short as possible. Let's also keep in mind that we have just seen a technological and communications revolution as a result of COVID-19. Imagine if we wouldn't have had Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and all the other options we've had. It's allowed people to work remotely. And I would argue it will lessen the impact on the labor force, because we are seeing not only workers choose to leave parts of the coast where costs are very high, housing costs, they're moving to more central locations where those housing costs are much lower, where there's less friction of life. And also it's allowing people who didn't have as many labor force options locally. Maybe they couldn't relocate to the coast. They had family that was close by, but now they can be hired by Silicon Valley tech firms or anywhere in the world. So let's not underappreciate the extent to which communications technologies have been harnessed. This change would have probably taken, I don't know, 10 to 20 more years before we would have seen what has happened. So let's end on, to some extent, a more positive note.
There you are. I can't say much more than that. Our time is up. I have to sincerely thank you all, Ross, Angie, and Thomas. Thank you very much for spending an hour with me and throwing you questions, big macro questions, but very insightful. Hopefully our audience enjoyed it as well. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.